Hello everyone, this is Pioneer Productions, and today I will be presenting you with the very first episode of Let's Talk Ideology, my new little series where I discuss every political ideology under the sun, or at least those that I have already researched. There is many more out there. For this episode, I will be specifically discussing probably one of the most well-known ideologies in human history, communism. Now, I trust many of you have already heard of communism one way or another, somewhere, from someone. Now, communism is interpreted in many ways, but I'm here to give you a basic rundown of what communism essentially is. What is it about? Where has it been tried? How has it worked out? And hopefully this will allow you a better understanding of communism as an ideology and as a form of government in practice. So, where to start? Well, I'll start just for the sake of simplicity with the dictionary definition, that being, quote, the belief in or practice of a social system based on the sharing of all work and property by the whole community, hence the name communism. Communism was formulated in 1848 upon the publishing of the treatise, the Communist Manifesto, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, two German philosophers. Now, this was published around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when industrial production created a whole new class of people. It also created a very tiny caste of very wealthy, very powerful people, comprised of things like factory owners, railway magnates, monarchs, other heads of state, you name it. These were the elite of the time, the ruling classes. Now, Marx's Communist Manifesto envisioned society as being comprised of two groups. There was oppressors and oppressed, with the upper caste being referred to as the bourgeois and the lower being referred to as the proletariat. Marx's version of history envisioned it as a struggle of the classes, with the upper classes trying to maintain their position, with the lower classes having to endure the severe working conditions imposed on them by their managers. Now, Marx believed that the only way to break this cycle of oppression and inequality was via revolution, wherein the lower classes, the proletariat, would rise up against the bourgeois. And this would result in the establishing of a communist society in which all the means of production, the factories and such, would be owned by the state, and thus would have their wealth and their products redistributed across the population in an equal way, thereby destroying inequality and allowing for an egalitarian society. At least that's how Marx envisioned it. In 1918, when the Russian Revolution came around, Lenin created his own little deviation of Marxism, which is communism as formulated by Marx, Leninism. Now, communism is not a single monolithic ideology. It's comprised of many subcategories, such as Stalinism, Maoism, Leninism, Juche socialism, the last one being practiced currently in North Korea with varying degrees of success. Now, most of these deviations are mostly meant to adapt communism to local conditions, and this is partially what has made communism have such a wide appeal, or at least had. Communism at its height controlled a huge proportion of the world, a huge proportion of the world's countries, and a huge proportion of the world's economy and population. The quintessential expression of communism was probably the Soviet Union, aka Russia before 1991. In Russia, how things worked was the state owned everything. All the industries, all the infrastructure, everything was owned by the state. And in theory, as Marx himself believed, this was supposed to ensure an equal society where everyone would get the full fruit of their labor. They would have access to everything that they produced. In Marx's word, to each according to his needs, and so on and so on and so on. However, in practice, this has proved to be a little bit more sketchy. In the Soviet Union, what happened was that this often meant stripping those who had built their wealth through legitimate means of what they had earned and giving it to others, sometimes those who had no inclination to work for their wealth. And this often meant that hard-earned money was redistributed to people who, put simply, were not deserving of it. And what is worse, that communism ultimately brought about was dictatorship. The Soviet Union, Communist China, North Korea, I could go on, all of them were classified as dictatorships, or dictatorships of the proletariat in communist terms. Lenin actually coined this term when developing his derivation of Marxism, and this was supposed to be a transitionary stage between the overthrow of the old capitalist order and the transition to a pure communist society. What this often resulted in was a long-lasting dictatorship that could only sustain itself via widespread destruction and killing. You may have heard of the Great Purge, the Great Famine, the Great Chinese Famine, if you want to be more specific. Now, communist regimes don't have a very good track record on achieving their goals. Owning the means of production often led to inefficiencies because the state bureaucracy was ill-equipped to handle the enormous complexities of the economy, of what people needed, of what people wanted. And most often what this led to was things like goods shortages, while the goods being produced were often of low quality so as to be unusable. Communism, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, so don't take it literally, too literally. Communism is a utopian ideology, which is, in my opinion, wholly unsuited to the realities of the world. It believes that the state has the means to redistribute wealth in an effective and efficient manner and ultimately bring about a society where everyone is equal. Now, on the surface, this may seem like a completely noble goal, but in reality, it isn't, and it has often led to genocides, economic collapse. It's one of the reasons why communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union fell apart in 1989. And it's why communism as a whole hasn't exactly seen the height of power that it once did, particularly during the Cold War. And what is there to pick up from this? Well, what can be gathered is that communism is an ideology based off of equality, a noble cause but terrible execution, as history can probably tell you. Now, this has been a very cursory glance at the ideology of communism, but for my next videos, I truly hope to give you a more insightful view into the other ideologies of history, such as, say for example, fascism or Nazism. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Pioneer Productions, signing off.